This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Fire and Silk by Megan Irene Turner. This book of original artwork and poetry spans the narrative of my own journey as both an author and an artist, and also elucidates on the words and illustrations as a glimpse into the metaphysical observer. I hope you enjoy. You can find it available now on Amazon.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. So, Brian, we've got a guest today. Why don't you tell us all about her and what we're going to be talking about? I'm really excited for this one because, as you know, I'm excited for every guest we have on the show.
You are excited. We're always excited. And it's good to be excited. Hey, today we are chatting to Desiree Richter, PhD. So not just Desiree Richter, garden variety, but PhD, who's a teacher, educator, dissertation coach in New Orleans, where she resides with her two youngest children. She writes about teacher education, doctoral student life, and parenting teens during the pandemic, which I'm sure a lot of us can definitely relate to. That was a heavy time. But we do want to delve into Desi's story and a book that she has recently released called The Presence of Absence. And that's a collection of essays that jumps into themes around parenting, loss, personal transformation, and navigating life. And there was a pretty big event that happened at Desi in the year 2000, which we're going to get to. But we really want to delve into a bit about her life first and talk about her fundy cred, essentially, which I think she does have some very, very good fundy cred. I really loved a book that it really talked to those. It was a bit at times cringy for me at the start because I was like, this person was really heavily into this shit as well. And you think about some of the stuff that you did and the experiences that you had, and it was just like, God, they are the things that we did, believed, and said. So I really invite you, Desi, today to talk about that stuff really openly and also your experience since leaving it and looking back and what it looks like, which we'll eventually get to. But Desi, for now, welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here with you both.
Well, the pleasure's all ours. But we are going to jump into that fundy cred first and ask the question that we'd love to ask all of our guests. Were you a teenage fundamentalist?
I feel like if there was a way to say, I was the most teenage fundamentalist in all the land, that the answer would be that, and then put that on steroids and then put that out on the internet a lot because it was very, very fundamentalist. And I don't think that you can become a teenage fundamentalist just on your own. But in my case, I would say that it was a very natural outgrowth of being, if you can, an infant fundamentalist, and a child fundamentalist, and then a teenage fundamentalist, and all the way on into my midlife. And in fact, my fundamentalism was very, very tied, I would say, to my father. He was and is a Southern Baptist minister who had a very, very rich and true for him conversion experience. And I believe it was on my birthday. I think I was a year old. So we had just been the Southern Alabama family living in rural Alabama. My father was a milkman and walked down the aisle one day, found the Lord, and then not too long after that, we were all uprooted to go to Texas, where he went to seminary, then sent north, as I like to say, to save all the Catholics in Ohio. And so, yeah, and I think the fact that I was a daddy's girl and in many ways still am, I just was a natural fold in to this all being very much baked into my heart, my body, my psyche from birth and right on into teenage fundamentalism. And I'd be happy to share anecdotes about what that looked like if you want to hear them.
I'm desperate to know your house in Alabama. Was it a sweet home?
I don't remember it. I was only like 2 when we moved to Texas. So it's not my house I remember, but the house of all of my extended family when we would go on these sojourns. And so they were sweet houses in their own way. Why do you ask?
Well, that was actually a Lynyrd Skynyrd gag, actually, because you go
Oh,
Sweet
the
Home
Sweet Home
Alabama.
Alabama.
Or was it Kid Rock? That's what I was going to ask. If it was a Sweet Home, was it a Kid Rock Sweet Home or was it a Lynyrd Skynyrd?
And see, the fact that I missed that cultural reference proves that I was a teenage fundamentalist who didn't know anything. But if you had given me like a Billy Graham or like a Just As I Am, I would have gotten it.
Sure. Well, see, for most Australians, that's about all that we would know about Alabama is that it's a sweet home. I mean, that's about as far as it would go, wouldn't it, Brian?
Yeah, pretty much. Hey, but tell us a little bit about that, about your growing up and what did it look like and some of your early memories of really being soaked in the Jesus of the Deep South.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the Jesus of the Deep South came north with us. So I like to say that we brought Bible Belt Jesus to northeastern Ohio. And, I say we because it just felt like the whole family was planting this church and started in a little school library. So I just feel like it's hard for me to think of a memory that doesn't involve something about Jesus. And that wasn't just because we were Sunday morning church, Sunday night church, Wednesday night church prayer meeting, Thursday night visitation, morning quiet times, all of these things that were happening in my life, but also just like these memories in the church because we were literally building a church from the ground up. So for us Baptists, you've got to have a baptistry. So as my father was hammering and making this church happen, I was like swimming in the baptistry or roller skating around on the concrete floors. And so that church literally felt like a home. And then in addition to that, I think it wasn't just that there was a religion and a faith that was coming to me that felt very, very real, because one of my first memories is walking down this aisle to the waiting arms of my father and just feeling so horrible somehow that as a 5-year-old, I had caused the death of God. I mean, I really believed that. But yet believing that somehow praying this prayer was going to help me. But it's the evangelical piece. So, I mean, I was just I would say I was kind of a weird kid because it was very knit. Even as a 5, 6, 7-year-old, I would be out on the street corner and I would do the kid thing, like look for the tadpoles and play around and pick grass and chew on it. And then like, oh, there's a car. Let me go hand them this steps to peace with God and see if I can get them saved. So it was very, very much a part of just the day-to-day life. And it just, you don't know any different. It just is your life.
Yeah, that sounds like you were a slightly weird kid, Desi. I'm going to confirm that. Playing with tadpoles and then giving out tracts. I mean, you were an evangelist at 5.
Pretty much, yeah.
Doesn't sound unlike me at sort of 15, though. I mean, except for the tadpoles bit, I mean, that's kind of where I was at as well. I would look for any opportunity to save the lost. So I'm connecting with that, even though for me it was more about being a teenage fundamentalist than being, I don't know, a preteen fundamentalist or even it even sounds like you're a bit of a toddler fundamentalist.
I think though, as your development happens cognitively and you start to understand some of the stakes of what it is that you are trying to get people to become involved in, the thing about being a teenage fundamentalist is it can sort of meld with like your teenage angst and your hormones. And I remember, kind of having a little small backsliding period when I was maybe 13 or 14 and maybe a couple of little questions and just wondering like, did I pray the prayer and really mean it enough? And again, my father being very patient with me through all this and sitting me down with scripture and trying to help me through this. But then at age 15, it's funny you mentioned that, Troy, it all got amped up more because we had this singing evangelist come to the church. And at the time, I think I had been in a little bit of a lull, but he came to the church, and as soon as he started singing and lifting his face up, the music got to me. And also I thought he was cute. So ended up dating this singing evangelist and basically singing with him and going around to all these different denominations of churches. And it's like it got wed with my love life. And I was like, okay, so of course I'm going to want to emulate this, and thinking, okay, this is the guy, that I'm going to marry, and we're going to go off and be evangelists. And for various reasons that did not happen. But I would say that as my understanding grew, it got more amped up as a teenager. But then again, when you grow a little more, I can look back to like journal entries from 16, 17, 18, where I'm like, oh, just seems so harsh that like, if they haven't heard about the Lord, they're going to go to hell forever. Lord, please help me understand this. And so I think that really, I've always been a wrestler. And so even though I wasn't a skeptic, but I was taking it all to the Lord, like just begging God, to help me understand this so that I could do it better for him.
Yeah, it's funny. Like our listeners would know this very well, Troy, and I often reflect on it. That was Troy in his deep, deep conviction that he had to reach everybody because they have to come and join us. Whereas I was never that invested. And at the time, I wouldn't have actually said this, that this is the way it was. But I mean, I went to Bible college, I was going to be a minister. I was a leader in the church. All of that stuff was happening. But I didn't really care enough, because I think deep down, I didn't think that people were going to go to hell. I didn't think that anything like that was that real, that there was such an urgency that I needed to reach people. But when I think about it, I went on a missions trip to Northern Europe, to Estonia. And when I was there, I felt like I had that deep conviction, or maybe I don't know what it was, but I had no problem actually street witnessing to people there. I had no problem, going and preaching in places there to try and get people to become Christians. And I don't know why the motivation was different, but maybe it's because it wasn't in my backyard. Maybe it's because I felt deeply embarrassed about Christianity.
But it was also that you were on a missions trip. Do you know what I mean? Like you had to, on some level, sort of, mentally go, well, this is why I'm here, and sort of step over, and cross that sort of barrier. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gone. So, I can imagine there's probably a lot of things at play.
So much at play, but in the end, it's because I didn't have a deep conviction, because I didn't truly deep down believe it enough for it to drive my behaviour. But anyway, just a segue. I was just listening to you and going, "Fuck, you were full on, Desi. You were really there."
Okay, so just to press that point forward, I want to say, yes, I was a better teenage fundamentalist than you, because we didn't go on mission trips. Your life is a mission trip.
Not hard to be a better fundamentalist than Brian. Not hard at all.
It's not my fundamentalist journey, even despite the name of this podcast, was really only about 4 years of my probably almost 20 years in Christianity. So the fundamentalist bit probably had the greatest, not probably, it did have the greatest impact on me. Sometimes positive, but mostly negative. And so I was always trying to get away from fundamentalism, but the message of fundamentalism always chased me. So I think that was probably the trickiest part of it. But, now I don't care. So, but Desi, back to you, because this isn't about me. Talk us through some of those experiences as a teenager, and which then eventually led up to you adulting as a teenage fundamentalist adult. No, as a fundamentalist adult, not a teenage fundamentalist adult.
Well, I think that basically the experiences just sort of continued on from what I was talking about earlier. Like, I would say that after I graduated from high school, which was a fundamentalist Christian high school, I started off college, and I remember just seeing college as my mission field. And I was there to get my education, but all of that education is to prepare you for how you can use your spiritual gifts and figure out what your calling is. And I was studying music and education because these just seemed like good, natural things. I liked them, but they were like, okay, I can definitely use these for the Lord. And I would bring my Bible in. And I remember very clearly, like some of them are funny. Standing back in the 90s, you would stand in line for registration when you would go register for your classes. And I was in Florida at the time, and it was very hot and the air condition was broken. And this gentleman was standing in line, who I later found out was an atheist because I was in class with him. And he said, "It's hotter than hell in here." And I looked at him in all seriousness and I said, "No, it's definitely not." And then I was speaking with another friend of mine who we were these math tutors. And when there was a lull, I remember I was like, okay, here's my in to start my witnessing. So I was talking to this gentleman, and he was Hindu. And so, I'm sharing with him, and I'm like, about your polytheism and all these things you believe. And he just looked at me and he said, it's just, I'm so open to what you think, and you're so closed to what I believe. And I think that might be the first time that it dawned on me that I was just a really bad evangelist, and that my natural human empathy and intelligence kept breaking through all of the fundamentalism dogma, all of the programming. Like, the human spirit is just a pretty strong thing. And if I had had the word fuck at the time, I just would have been like, fuck, mate, I guess you're right. Like, where do we go from here? And instead, I think I was just like, in my mind, I was like, well, I got to go pray about this. And, and it was frustrating because I was like, Jesus, you said you would give me the words to say, and it didn't have the words to say. And, so I went on like that. And I think that what happened is that moving from there into more young adulthood and marrying very young, I would say at 21, I would say that's marrying pretty young at the time. It didn't feel like it. My then husband and I began the shift to more of this relational evangelism style, and the idea that and this is a longer journey, but the journey towards, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. And just like, I think it's a pretty decent incarnation. If you're going to go down this road, is like, okay, I'm not going to preach at you. I'm not going to have my Romans road and all my Bible verses, at least not for a while. I'm actually just going to try to love you and be the love of God. And then let's see what comes from that. And yes, I still wanted to get them to pray the prayer, but it wasn't so much like, I don't know, PowerPoint Jesus, or like friends that would visit our evangelical church in Florida. And we had these massive worship teams that I was on, and they're like, it was like Disney Jesus. So it's like you're trying all these different marketing techniques to get people to come to the Lord. And I just have to say that I don't think I was very good at it. And that's very odd, because I did all the things, but I didn't have a whole lot of cognitive dissonance about the faith itself. I just couldn't figure out like why I was bad at this one thing.
Desi, as I'm listening to you, it sounds more like Amway Jesus to me. Like, come in, and I've got this product that you really need. You just don't know you need it, and it's going to change your life. And we're going to be friends while we do it. And hey, this isn't about marketing. This isn't about the product. This is about building community. And that's how Amway was. I'm hearing Amway Jesus. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, it's pretty culty as well, for sure.
Absolutely. The old multi-level marketing is wonderful. Hey, you mentioned your husband. So 21 when you got married. How did you meet, and what was the events that led up to? I would assume, like most fundamentalist relationships, it was a pretty quick courting and to marriage. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we met in that same little Christian high school. We were in the same grade with a little graduating class of 18 people. And I don't want to brag, but we were both at the top of the class of those 18 people. And he was and is an incredibly intelligent man. And we were just good friends. And at the time I was dating the evangelist. And, so nothing really happened. And then after high school, as events would have it, we sort of came back into each other's lives. And okay, I definitely want to be clear for the record that I fell in love with my husband and that was a wonderful thing. But as far as the vetting process for should we get married, I remember at the time I was dating this guy who was an engineer and he was Christian, but I just didn't feel like he was quite Christian enough. And what I mean by that is like he just couldn't be the spiritual head of the home. And you got to remember, I came from a home where my father was the literal head of the church, and it was not like some of these really bad culty homes where the dad is just super mean and abusive. Like my dad is a kind man, but he could lead the Bible studies. He could lead you in prayer. And so I was like, I want this in my marriage. And the man that I married, I thought, okay, he has some of these qualities. And it just was a sense through conversation that he believed deeply enough. And so I remember very clearly when we got engaged, talking about being on mission together and how that was like wedded into the wedding. And whether we were working secular jobs or not, that there would be life on mission and going into the mission field in some fashion. So I think it was, we met when we were 15, but it was 21, but it was a very short engagement after having known each other for a while. And I think that I don't know exactly what that was, but I remember him saying, okay, if we're going to do this, like, let's just go ahead and get married. So we had a 6-month engagement and a fundamentalist wedding, and off we went.
It's funny though, isn't it? Because that's the way it often is. I know that Brian and I have both told our stories about meeting this for us, a woman, and is she the right person for my ministry? It was sort of that God first, family second, ministry third. But actually for me, and I'm not sure if this is true for you, Brian, but really that ministry was even second or, tied second with the marriage, because if this person got in the way of the ministry, then they're out. And it was like a job interview. It wasn't a compatibility. Are we going to be okay together, physically, mentally, emotionally? It was, are we going to be able to do God's will together? So I'm totally vibing with what you're saying. It's so far very, very normal, fundy experience. And I think you're well establishing your cred for sure.
Yeah, and absolutely, Troy. I think about the job interview stuff, and I know that we have spoken about this. My ex-wife was a creative, and studied at one of the big creative colleges here in Melbourne. And I often not only thought about it, but we talked about it and go, how does your creativity fit in with my ministry? And how does this work? Are you going to dance while I preach and all of that sort of stuff? And that was literally the conversations that we would have. Like, how does it work? How does your creativity work within the very boundary of ministry, which I had dreamt I was going to have and felt that God had told me that I was going to have. So it is fucking bizarre. Like the relational stuff definitely is third or fourth down the list.
2 things about the relationships in marriages is we often talk about in these spaces patriarchy and roles and how they are so clearly defined and complementary. How do you say that? Complementarism, whatever that is. You're complementary. And I know that it really is unfair to women, but I think it's, looking back, I think it's really unfair to men when you think of a 21-year-old, like I parent a 22-year-old boy, man. And to say to them, you are going to be leading out this family in this way. When most of us, the 20s are just insane. Most of us don't know what the heck we're about. So that's the first point, is that these strict role definitions cause harm to both parties. And I would like to kind of call that out. The second is the idea of gifts. And one of the things I wrote about in my book is that fundamentalism strip mines our souls. It strip mines us of our gifts, and it co-opts them, and they can't just be your gift that is for your own enjoyment or to bring good into the world in a way that you get to have agency around. So just as your former wife's gifts were being co-opted into your ministry, and just the very idea that all of those gifts are being co-opted under the umbrella of the ministry, which then comes under the larger umbrella of the epic battle for the souls of humanity. I mean, it sure all sounds nice if you believe that that battle exists. But if you then take that into a teenager or a young child, our tasks, our developmental tasks are to be figuring out who we are and what we love and how we want to be in the world. And it squashes it all. And so I think that has been a huge reckoning when you do leave fundamentalism, is what are all these ways that a person's gifts and personalities, their very soul, talk about like wanting to save a soul, like it's actually doing the opposite of saving a soul, and it's flattening a soul. And it was happening in my marriage. It's not that I didn't have gifts that didn't get developed as being that help meet, which is still just the weirdest word in the world to me. But as I was a helpmeet suitable to my husband, I learned how to research. I learned how to do presentations. I was supporting him through his schooling endeavors and finishing mine. And oftentimes when the kids came along, like with a baby on my breast, doing all of that. So it's not that you don't learn and grow, but it's all happening in this very, very narrow lane. And I mean, don't you just kind of wonder like what you might have been if all of that had just been allowed to blossom and flourish in a more organic way?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I find myself checking myself, even though, I've been out of the scene, I don't know what it is, mentally 20 odd years, but physically 15 years out of the scene. And I quite often check myself going, what you're doing right now actually doesn't have to have a greater good, because quite often I think, oh, what is the purpose to life? What's the greater good to what I'm doing? And I'm always trying to find a greater good in what I do. And I think it's a bit of a hangover from fundamentalism for me. It's it's an interesting space to reflect on.
Desi, let me ask you, it sounds like to this point you're happy. It sounds like there's this crack showing, but you're pretty much going along with everything. But something happened. Didn't something happen to throw everything off kilter, to throw, basically to unsettle everything? Do you want to tell us about that?
Happy is an interesting word. I think that I definitely had some wrestlings and rumblings and like a little bit of cognitive dissonance about this particular version of the faith. And I was able to sort of put them back in their box and keep moving forward, and even accept that a little bit of doubt is part of the process. And again, I feel like my fundamentalist father, it's just hard to flatten any one single human. And I remember him very clearly saying to me, if you can't question your faith, he said it in his Alabama way, if you can't question your faith, it's not worth a plug nickel. And so I was encouraged to question. Now, I don't know how they felt about the ultimate outcome of that questioning, but I really did believe him. Like, it wasn't this thing where like, you're not allowed to ask questions. So I'd like to paint the picture of the year 2000. I'm a young married fundamentalist existing in a rather large evangelical church, not quite a mega church, one of these non-denominational churches that's pretty big. And we are in leadership in this church. At this point in time, we're in a church where the idea of having small groups had really taken root. So we were visiting small groups with other families, and there were a lot of families with young children. And at this point in time, we had two children, my son, Elijah, who was about 2 years old, and then one child who was born about 2 years later than him. And in the fall of 2000, not too long after we had had our formal dedication for Elijah in front of the entire church family, we decided to create for him a gift of love. And this gift of love created an accident in our home. And the outgrowth of this accident is that Elijah passed away. So he passed away one night sleeping in his bed. We put him to bed, and the next morning he was found. He did not wake up. And when this happened, I felt immediately like I understood Job going to his knees. And I just fell to the ground, and my first response was to pray. And that was an honest response. And this event, there's no way that you can lose a child and not be fundamentally altered and go through a radical transformation process in your psyche. Everybody knows it's a psychic rending. And I say to this day that when people say, I can't imagine, I contend that I think you can imagine. And it's just one of those things that we don't like to talk about. And the immediate response from our church family was an absolute outpouring of love and care. And I will forever be grateful to those people who came to our home and held us and loved us. And I would not say that immediately after losing Elijah, I lost my faith. But I would like to say that is when we're in grief and when we have times of loss, we don't know which way it's going to go. And some of us dig deeper into faith or it changes it. Did that for a while. But for me, it was sort of the beginning of ripping open and not being able to ignore who I thought God the Father was, who I thought Jesus was, what I thought the world was supposed to be like, and the world that was actually unfolding in front of me.
Desi, it's obviously, a fair bit of time has passed, but I'm sure that it's still incredibly raw. So thank you for your vulnerability in opening up and talking about this, and obviously writing about in your book. I think it's a really important thing for us to spend a little bit of time on, in that I think grief and loss is hard enough within itself, and it has so many layers to it. But one of the things you talk about in your book, and it's a bit of a longer process, but the additional layers that you have in there, the complexity of dealing with this grief and loss, all the while trying to maintain that narrative of a loving and a gracious God. How did that work out for you? What was some of the stuff happening for you there?
Yeah. I think that when you're dealing with any sort of really big grief or loss, you are, of course, going to be trying to make some sort of sense of it. It creates a psychic rending of the way that you were living in the world before you had a loss, and this version of you that is now in the world. And the world hasn't necessarily changed, but you are. And so when you overlay that, when you overlay a mother whose psyche is in shambles with a belief system that doesn't shift, it does become very, very complex, and it becomes very, very difficult. In my case, it became very difficult to actually grieve. And one of the reasons for that is because fundamentalists are often very well versed in the art of spiritual bypassing. And when we're bypassing something in this way, we are superimposing an explanation on it that doesn't allow us to actually feel the very, very hard feelings that are going on. So you mentioned this narrative of a good and loving God. I didn't really question that for a while. What happened, though, is I had a really hard time at first trying to help God get the glory, because all things are supposed to work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So I was like, okay, somehow this is supposed to work for good. But you can see right away where the cognitive dissonance comes in, because how in the world can there be anything good about putting a child to sleep one night and waking up and your child is no longer there? And fundamentalism co-opted the grief process. And instead, I think I sort of became a spectator to my own grief. And I remember having conversations with people, one in particular with a college professor who had called to offer her condolences and asked how I was doing. And I just sidestepped the question. I said, well, the Lord is going to receive glory from this. And she just stopped me in my tracks. And she's a Christian, but she just said, my God doesn't get glory out of the death of little babies. And I really couldn't hear it. But I think what really happened is, in addition to trying to go I was like, now I really have to be on the witnessing train, because how can this possibly, where's that greater good if a lot of people don't get saved because of this? Or if people don't see my faith because of this? And then it got even more confusing, because there are verses, I kept going to the Bible, and there's these verses about enduring hardship as discipline. I was like, what in the world did I do if this is some sort of discipline? And you get into all this fear about, you're supposed to be raising your children as arrows in the hands, for the Lord. And, did I just love him too much? Was he an idol? And then it came, so you're just tied up in knots trying to fit this thing that in the end was a horrible accident that two fallible humans were a part of. Not some grand scheme that the Lord engineered, because I was like, well, that makes God a monster. Or if I somehow messed up and this had to happen to me so that I could be refined in the fire and go through a dark night of a soul, what kind of a monster am I? And I just kept having these dilemmas. And I mean, these went on for probably 11, 12, 13 years. And so the fundamentalism kind of kept me tied up in that. And I didn't believe that, I don't even think I believed that I deserved to grieve. And so I think while there would be moments of it, I think what instead happened is the fundamentalism just created a very deep depression. And as I was continuing to drive that belief system faster and faster and have more children and continue to try to raise them, I really think that it led me to a point of just utter mental, physical, and emotional exhaustion. And that is where a lot of my losing of my faith came from.
What do you think it did to, at the time, obviously there's probably a lot of mental gymnastics that took place, which I think you alluded to. What was it doing to your relationship with not only your husband, but I guess that familial relationship? You continued to have, you had four children that you're eventually still raising after you have more children. What was it doing to the relationship there now in hindsight when you look back on it?
I think I kept a lot of it on the inside. And I remember when I did finally lay it all down, a lot of people were very, very surprised, because I just didn't know how to bring this up in the context of the community that I was with. I did some, and people did actually, to their credit, try to help. I think that unfortunately, and again, I think in my book, I try to not come across as a beatific mother who did it all right. Because I think when we're fundamentalists who are raising fundamentalist babies, we are perpetuating the same harm that was done to us. But unfortunately, I think that because it basically basically turned into a depression. My kids just got a mom who, while loved them and loves them so, so much, just wasn't capable of being present in the ways that they truly needed. I did a lot of things right, even in the middle of that state, but it's like I was still raising them and doing all the things on the outside, but I don't know, Brian, maybe it was a little more like you when you were a teenager, where I was like, I'm doing this, but it just doesn't have all of the vector of the hope and that teenage optimism and idealism. It had gotten sort of rounded out and bottomed out. And so I was doing that thing with them, teaching them all the things, while at the same time doing what I think a lot of people do who eventually leave the faith, or this faith, is searching for a version of it that would fit. So, I mean, I think I've always been a seeker. I think I will always be a seeker. And so I was moving more and more towards these more liberal versions of the faith, and reading authors like Rob Bell and Love Wins and those books. I don't know if y'all came across him, but our pastor came over one night and was not happy that we had been reading this book, which espouses universalism. And so I think it's like there were two things happening at once. There was the forward-facing Desi who was still espousing this, and then there was the inner Desi who was, I mean, you know, I wasn't one of those people who left quietly. And I think that one of the reasons it took me so long to leave is because I knew that would be another grief. That would be another thing that I would have to let go of. And honestly, I think I felt like I had already lost a lot. And, but I don't think that I would have left if Elijah hadn't passed away, because I just think that, unfortunately, and I think we see this a lot in politics, until something happens to us, I don't know if it's something in the human brain and our wiring, it's really easy to logic it away. But when that missile comes into your soul and the problem of pain hits your heart, I think first you have to reckon with the pain itself and be in it and allow it and allow the grief to work through you. And then maybe you can get to some of the intellectual reckonings. And I think I did it backwards. And I kept trying to find all the intellectual pieces and stitch it all back together. But it just felt flimsier and flimsier every time I tried to sew those stitches and proof text things and turn to the scripture. It's just like diminishing returns, and it felt less and less and less comforting. And I think at the end of the day, the human part of me that did want to show up authentically in relationship finally said, okay, if there's going to be a Desi here to parent these children whom I brought into the world and whom it is my duty to be the best mom that I can be, however imperfect she is, I'm going to have to let this other stuff go. And so it's very interesting that it was grief, which is part of love, and it was love for these babies that were still here, that made me say, okay, we're not choosing doctrine and dogma over people anymore. We're done with that. We're choosing people as they are.
Desi, I'm listening to your story, and I know that you did mention some sort of time frames, but how long was that period where you were trying to hold on, and yet there was a part of you that had already let go or was letting go? What was the scale of that, the time scale?
I can timestamp it in some ways, but it's such a weird thing, right? To try to go back and stitch together your own narrative. But Elijah passed in 2000, and it was 2012. It was the spring of 2012 when I remember praying so earnestly, God, I am so tired. I want to believe this. And I think this is a really important point. People will look at an ex-fundamentalist and say, you never believed it. I think we've assuredly proven that I did. And they say, you don't want to do it. Well, you just don't want to do it. You just want to go sin. No, I wanted this. But in 2014, all by myself, I prayed a prayer that was like, please help me find you. Help me hold on to this if it's true. Because I had considered the cost of what tearing that tower down would be. And so, yeah, it was 14 years of this struggle, this wrestling.
Which I think it's not uncommon. And if I parallel that, even though I didn't have that grief and loss overlay, I tried for over 10 years to have some moderate expression of faith or something that would actually be able to help me hang on. And exactly what you spoke about, I went for those progressive expressions. I started to drop away things like, virgin birth, hell not being literal, anything to go, I can still hang on to this central tenet, but there's nothing left in the end.
You even read Rob Bell. I mean, that was part of your journey as well.
I was promoting Rob Bell to you. I remember I'd loved Rob Bell, and I still think he has some great things to say. But I think it is such a common part of people's stories, Desi.
It is. And then you get to this point where you say, okay, I've dropped this fundamental, and now I've dropped this fundamental, and now I've dropped this fundamental. Like, what's left? And I think that for me, when I stopped believing that people are fundamentally evil, when I looked inside and said, nope, we're not fundamentally evil and we don't need to be saved, I was like, oh, well, okay. I think that basically is the foundational pillar of this whole story. And I don't believe it anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's a tough bit. So what do you do with that? Like, how did you seek to replace it? Is it something that you that evolution, I guess, led you to a place where you found meaning and purpose in something else? Or how did that work out for you?
Well, at the beginning, I got into my curious mind. I don't think that I was seeking to replace it with some antithetical truth that I could then lock into and say, okay, I now have certitude around these things. Instead, I think what I did is I just got very, 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 very curious. And instead of going to church on Sunday mornings, I would go to the bookstore. And I would start reading all of these deconversion stories because you feel so very alone. And I thought it felt like my mind had been in a steel sieve. And this was like one of the greatest joys is like, I'm allowed to just read a book because I want to read the book and I don't have to be reading it with my apologist lens on. So I'm sure I was looking for, some worldview. And of course I was hanging out with atheists and I was reading about different religions. But I do know that one thing I didn't feel like it would be kind to my children to do, who were young at the time, is to say, okay, well, mom used to believe this and I don't believe that anymore. And now here's what I believe and you should believe it too. It felt like that would be a bit harsh on their young psyches. Because I was so teaching them one way. And I think that they probably thought I had gone nuts because I hadn't really talked about it very much. So instead, I just wanted to create a place where, okay, yeah, this is it. I wasn't as curious about figuring out what Desi the human believed now and what new set of truths could come in and guide my life. I just wanted to know who Desi the human was and is. I wanted to know what she thought and what she felt and how she moved through the world and how might she show love if love was not tainted by trying to manipulate people into believe something. I wanted to know what it was like to just have a friend that I just was like, oh, you're a cool person. Can we just be friends? And of course, in amongst that, I was reading and trying to figure things out, but I wouldn't say that I've even landed on that now. And I guess what's really fun about it is that I don't feel the need to. I don't feel the need to say, well, now I'm an atheist, or now I'm an agnostic, and now I believe this. I just feel a lot more free to say, I'm exploring this, and I value these things, and I am now free to get the lazy Susan of ideas out and be like, who am I reading tonight? Come hang out with me and let's learn.
I think it was interesting, Desi, and I think it really demonstrated how much you had grown, that you weren't just looking to replace the beliefs. And even in the way that you treated your kids, I mean, if you really thought, hey, this is the new truth, then you would have just, been bombarding them with it and saying, here's what you are to believe, which would have shown that you hadn't journeyed that far away from fundamentalism at all. And the fact that you had, and the fact that you saw it that way, that shows me that you were definitely journeying into a more inclusive, a more tolerant, a more empathetic space.
Fundamentalism is not curious. And I think that most humans are innately curious. Desi the human is innately curious. Children are curious. Cats are curious. And so I think it's important that we're talking about being a teenage fundamentalist here within our own particular context. But like once you really start looking at what fundamentalism is, you can see it in so many different contexts. And you could be a fundamentalist atheist, right? You could be a fundamentalist whatever. It's not the specifics of every creed. It's the rigidity. It's that it's all answered for you. And if you start questioning this, there is likely going to be some sort of retribution, either direct or that you are going to believe will happen to you. Once the fundamentalism gets embedded in high control groups of any kind, it becomes a very powerful force for control. So why would I want to be part of that again?
Oh, totally. It's interesting when my ex-wife found out about this podcast. We've been split 13, 14 years. But when she found out about the podcast, she started sending me YouTube videos of this fundamentalist guy and started sending me emails and going, what do you believe? What do you believe? And I said, I actually don't know what I believe, but I don't believe that anymore. And she couldn't deal with, she's still a fundamentalist, couldn't deal with the fact, and this is, less than 2 years ago, could not deal with the fact that I did not have any fundamental beliefs in something. And I was just like, I really don't know. And I'm really comfortable with not knowing. I actually feel more comfortable not knowing than that certainty that I used to feel, and try and keep that cognitive dissonance going, and the reinforcing little confirmation bias, keep that all going. So I felt more comfortable now, and she couldn't get it. She just started to get really annoyed with me and said I needed to watch these videos and I needed to understand what it was really about. So some people just can't move past that.
I think that you're hooking into the fact that there are some real benefits to fundamentalism if you're not having any cracks in the belief system. It's just things are settled and you have your template. And as long as you don't have evidence that really comes in and wants to pry one of those beliefs up, then you can just kind of bump along in your life. And I think any change is exhausting and it's time consuming. And yeah, it would have been in some ways simpler and easier for me to just keep that status quo. And there's just sometimes, I think, to our discussion earlier, things come along that if you really have that fundamentalism wed to your psyche, it takes a pretty big crowbar to pull that up and to be humbled and say, okay, I guess I'm going to be willing to venture out and become extremely uncomfortable and not maintain the benefit of having these beliefs settled, as well as all of the social benefits of the built-in community. Because if you're in the inn, if you're with us and things are going well for you, it's actually quite nice in many ways.
Desi, you've talked about how the belief system evolved, but then also things started to drop away. And I like Brian's analogy of spiritual Jenga. We start to pull it out until eventually it all sort of topples. But underneath all this is this loss of a child. So how did that grow? How did your interpretation of that change? How did that impact everything that was going on? Did it break out, or did you just slowly uncover it and realize that you'd been burying it for so long?
Oh, it's so hard to really know exactly everything that was going on. But I think that one of the things that happened is that even though I feel a sense of moral injury, if you're somebody who accidentally causes a death, you live with that. You live with that. But I also think that removing the fundamentalism overlay and saying and not having to say things like, Satan came in and caused this death, or God caused this death, or I was being used by God to cause this death, it in effect right-sized Elijah's passing. And of course, Elijah's passing to me is absolutely enormous. But I think it would be a bit hubristic to not say that many, many people have experienced great pain and great loss. And I am one of those people. And so I think that what happened is that in right sizing it, I just became a mom. I didn't become a spiritual warrior, a soul winner. I just became a mom who was very, very, very sad. And so this well of grief, I would say I'm talking 2-3 years ago, y'all, that I finally was able to move through some of this grief. And I really want to make sure that we don't think about grief as a problem to be solved or something to get over. It's just that when you're in early grief, you are in grief. And then once you have digested some of that grief, the grief is in you. And so I finally got to the point where I realized that I wanted to be here. And I wanted to be on this planet in all of its beauty and its gloriousness and its devastatingness and cruelty, the whole shebang. There was this part of me that was like, oh, even with this great pain, I want to be here and I want to see the story of my children's lives. So I'm going to have to grieve. And I wanted to grieve. I think that the fundamentalism made me think that I didn't deserve to grieve. And speaking of dark things, I was like, well, I don't think I even deserve to be on this planet. And then again, the love for the kids is like, no, they deserve for you to be on the planet. And so when it fell away, I allowed myself to begin seeking comfort. And it's so ironic because Jesus himself said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. But boy, we want to skip the mourning part. We just want to slide right. And that's not a Christian thing. I don't know what that is, if that's an American thing or a Western thing or a capitalism thing, but we are so uncomfortable with people who are in deep sorrow. So first I had to get comfortable with myself and just say, this woman is brokenhearted and she's going low and she is going to allow herself to feel the depths of her baby being gone and actually live with that, not just exist with that. And there is precedent for that in the world. There's precedent for that in books. We can look to many, many places to find ways to live with the very, very hard things in our lives. And I think that's ultimately what I did.
Look, I think it's a human thing, Desi, to try and avoid any sort of suffering or hurt to self. And there's some cultures which we could definitely call out and say they do it better. But I think as a global community, we've shied away from death and talking about death as part of our lives. And I think that is partly to blame. It's we're wanting that everlasting youth and health, and I think we see a pursuit of that. So I think that is partially to blame as to why we can't actually talk about that stuff and accept it better.
But let's not understate the fact that this religion that we were a part of for the longest time is all about, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? I mean, this was all about death and overcoming death. Jesus conquered death, and we'd sing the songs. And so, and that's been a very much a big part of Western culture as well, not just fundamentalism and our journey. So I think Christianity, both historically and culturally, but also for us as individuals, I think it has a big part to play in our wanting to sort of shun death.
Yes, this is very, very true. Let's not let fundamentalism get away with it. Now, Desi, I know a lot of people are sitting there going, yeah, but what happened to a marriage? What happened to her husband relationship? We're not going to address that, because I'm going to say to people, buy the book. Buy the book and hear all the other stuff. Buy the book and hear all the other, huge amounts of vulnerability, but also you deal with this with good humour, honesty, and, that real emotional depth that I think we've heard today. So I just want to say to people, buy The Presence of Absence by Desiree Richter, whatever your search engine helps you get to. But Desi, what do you want to leave people with today? What's your key message, I guess, that you want to deliver out of the story that you have put into your book?
I think that you sort of tapped into it when you said the word human. I think that for many people who listen to this podcast, reclaiming your humanity in all of its messiness might be something that is pretty high on your agenda. And I think that, I guess, one of the key things that I've come to believe is that a part of that humanity is going to involve grief and sorrow. And the book started out sort of with this fundamentalism thread, which is huge. But as I have moved away from fundamentalism and towards just being a human, I would say to people, we are an instrument with a very wide range of the ability to experience highs and lows in the register of that experience. And that if we will allow ourselves to go into grief with some trusted souls there with us, that's nothing to fear. And that it will open us up to the other range of human experiences of joy, silliness, all of it. It's all there for us. And that is what we can reclaim when we drop the fundamentalism and open ourselves up to our humanity.
Some great sage advice, Desi. So I want to thank you for that. We will put links to the book in the show notes and any other links that you want to send us, Desi, that of how people can connect with you and correspond with you. I guess is that something that you would like us to do, that if people are struggling with some of this stuff, that they can reach out to you as well?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Hey, Desi, thank you so much for making the time to share a bit of your story, but also sharing your book with us. I think it's been a great chat, which I think a lot of people are going to get something from. And it's not just those people that are grieving, but it's about how you leave faith and how you actually make those reconnections as well. Such valuable insights that you've got into that.
Thank you. It's been such a joy to talk with you both.
Thanks, Desi.
If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion cost of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Clifford. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.